They came for him with chisels, not armies. Long before the king was dead, men stood in the Egyptian sun and hacked his name out of stone. His temples were broken, his city emptied, his memory treated like a disease. What kind of ruler scares a civilization so much that it tries to pretend he never existed? By the end, even Egypt's official king lists would skip over him as if his reign had never happened. But Akhenaten had not been a weak king, or a forgotten prince, or a harmless dreamer. For a moment, he was the most dangerous man in Egypt, because he did not just want to rule the kingdom. He wanted to replace its soul. When he died, the city he built for his god was already beginning to feel like a ghost. Its broad roads still cut through the desert, but the certainty that had built them was fading fast. The royal court would drift away. The old temples would breathe again. And the child who followed him would change his own name just to prove Egypt had turned its back on Akhenaten's revolution. Later kings would go further. They would tear down his monuments, reuse his building blocks, and bury his story under the weight of official silence. So to understand why Egypt erased him, you have to go back to the moment before the erasure. Back to the prince born into one of the richest, most confident empires on earth. He entered the world as Amenhotep, a son of the royal house of the 18th dynasty. His father, Amenhotep III, ruled during a time of wealth, diplomatic prestige, and monumental building. This was not a kingdom in crisis. Egypt was powerful, stable, and drenched in ritual confidence. Gold flowed in from abroad. Foreign rulers wrote to the pharaoh, like petitioners speaking to the sun. The great temples were rich beyond measure, and none stood higher than the cult of Amun at Thebes. That mattered, because when the young prince grew into a king, he would inherit not just a throne, but a state crowded with ancient gods and powerful priesthoods. At first, nothing suggested he would become the man history remembers as Akhenaten. He came to power as Amenhotep IV, and the early part of his reign seems to have followed familiar royal patterns. He was still a son of the old order. He still stood inside a world that had lasted for centuries. He married Nefertiti, the queen who would become inseparable from his story. Together, they would build one of the strangest courts in Egyptian history. But before that court stunned the world, something in the king began to shift. Not objects time, not object shades, not in a single lightning strike. More like a narrowing of attention as one divine image rose higher and higher in his mind. The god was Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Aten was not unknown before him, but under Amenhotep IV, this radiant force began to move toward the center. And once it reached the center, everything else in Egypt would have to move aside. To understand how radical that was, you have to remember what Egypt's religion really was. It was not just a set of beliefs. It was the rhythm of life, death, farming, kingship, burial, festival, and cosmic balance. The old gods lived everywhere. They lived in the great state temples, in local shrines, in funerary texts, in processions, in names, in memory itself. You could not simply swap them out like decorations at a palace. And yet that is close to what Akhenaten tried to do. Somewhere in those early regnal years, the king's devotion to Aten hardened into something much more extreme. He began building major temples for the sun disk at Karnak, right in the shadow of old power. These new temples looked different from what Egypt knew. Traditional sanctuaries often carried the god inward into dark sacred space. Aten's worship moved the opposite way. It opened itself to light. Roofless courts offering tables under the sky architecture made for sunlight instead of mystery. Even the building methods began to change. Small standardized stone blocks made construction faster, almost as if urgency had entered the royal imagination. Then came the break. In the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV changed his name. He became Akhenaten, usually understood as something like effective for the Aten or useful to the Aten. It was more than a rename. It was a declaration that the king now belonged to a new order. And he did not stop with his own identity. He founded the new capital in Middle Egypt on a site he claimed belonged to no earlier god. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today, we call the place Amarna. At the time, it was an act of astonishing political theater. A king abandoning the old sacred centers and building an entirely new city for a single god. Boundary stellae carved into the cliffs marked out the chosen landscape. This was not presented as an experiment. It was presented as destiny. And so the desert began to bloom with royal will. Palaces rose. Temples spread open to the sun. Administrative quarters, houses, workshops, roads, and ceremonial spaces appeared with startling speed. Akhetaten was not meant to grow slowly like an ordinary city. It was meant to arrive. At its center stood the great Aten temples, exposed to the sky, drenched in the harsh brilliance of day. Nothing about this program whispered compromise. Everything about it announced a king remaking reality. The court moved there. Officials moved there. Artists, scribes, servants, laborers, and craftsmen followed the gravitational pull of the pharaoh's new world. And in that world, Akhenaten and Nefertiti did not present themselves like earlier royal couples. They felt more visible, more intimate, more strangely immediate. This is one reason his reign still feels so alive on the walls. You see the royal family beneath the rays of Aten. You see daughters perched on laps, kissed by their parents, lifted into scenes that feel almost shockingly personal for royal art. The art of the Amarna period broke old habits. Bodies stretched into new shapes. Faces lengthened. Bellies, hips, chins, and limbs took on exaggerated forms that still unsettle modern viewers. For generations, people tried to explain those images as proof of illness or deformity. But the truth is probably more complicated. This was style, ideology, and symbolism as much as anatomy. Akhenaten was not just changing what Egypt worshipped. He was changing what divine kingship looked like. And this may be the most important part of the whole story. Aten was not simply elevated above the other gods. Access to Aten increasingly ran through the king himself. If the old gods could be approached through many temples, many priests, many local traditions, Aten became more tightly bound to one royal household. Akhenaten and his family stood beneath the rays. They received the god's life directly. Everyone else stood farther back. That made the system powerful. It also made it fragile. Because a religion spread across a civilization can survive a weak ruler. A religion concentrated inside one family rises and falls with that family. Still, from the king's point of view, the logic must have felt irresistible. The old temples were wealthy. The priesthood of Amen had immense influence. For a pharaoh determined to reassert royal authority, a new god could also become a new political center. The king began striking at the old order. Names of Amun were erased in places. Old divine images were attacked or displaced. By the later years of his reign, the campaign against traditional cults had become far more aggressive. This is why later generations would remember him with such bitterness. Not because he quiet, they preferred one god. Because he moved against a whole sacred system that had held Egypt together. Festivals changed. Patronage changed. The daily language of devotion changed. Even names carrying traces of other gods could become politically dangerous. And yet, for a while, Akhenaten seemed unstoppable. He had the crown. He had the capital. He had the monuments. He had a queen of extraordinary prominence beside him. Nefertiti was no shadow figure in this drama. Again and again, she appears in scenes of worship and ceremony with unusual power and visibility. At Amarna, the royal family became almost a sacred unit. Not merely rulers of Egypt, but the chosen channel through which divine light touched the world. And if you lived inside that court, the vision must have felt overwhelming. A city built from revelation. A god visible in every sunrise. A king convinced he had seen deeper truth than generations before him. That kind of certainty can be magnetic. It can also be terrifying. Because once a ruler decides he alone understands reality, every tradition becomes an obstacle. Every rival center of meaning becomes an enemy. And that is exactly where the fatal weakness entered the story. Akhenaten's problem was not belief. It was absolute certainty. He seems to have believed that if something was true to him, it could be made permanent by decree. That if old rituals were dismantled and new monuments raised, Egypt itself would be remade from the top down. But civilizations are not stone alone. They are habit, memory, burial practice, local loyalty, family piety, inherited words, and the invisible glue of repetition. Akhenaten could redirect labor. He could carve new names. He could build a city from the desert. He could not command every Egyptian heart to forget the gods of their ancestors. And while all this was happening at home, the outside world did not freeze and wait for Egypt's religious revolution to finish. This is where the Amarna letters matter. In Akhetaten, archaeologists found clay tablets carrying diplomatic correspondence from the wider Near Eastern world. These letters reveal an empire still entangled in marriage politics, tribute, gifts, rival kings, and anxious vassals. Some later writers have treated them like a smoking gun, proof that Akhenaten abandoned foreign policy while staring at the sun. That story is tempting. It is also probably too simple. The letters do show unease, pressure, and requests for help. But ancient states were always negotiating crisis, and the evidence does not give us one neat courtroom verdict. Still, the impression is hard to shake. While messages moved in from Syria and the Levant, the king's energy at home was consumed by theological revolution. Whether that caused imperial weakness directly or not, it tells you where his attention was fixed. And that is the tragedy of his peak. At the moment he looked most visionary, he was also becoming narrower. Everything that did not fit the Aten-centered order mattered less. Everything that had once balanced Egypt became secondary to one blinding idea. Akhetaten itself captured that tension. On one level, it was a dazzling political creation. On another, it was a city that existed because one man wanted it to exist. Take away the man, and what remained? Not deep roots. Not centuries of sacred legitimacy. Just roads, walls, courtyards, and an enormous demand that the future obey the king's revelation. If you have made it this far, I want to ask you something. Was Akhenaten a visionary far ahead of his time, or a ruler so proud he mistook obsession for truth? And if a leader tried to replace a nation's deepest beliefs overnight, would genius even matter? Drop your answer in the comments, because with Akhenaten, the line between prophet and destroyer is exactly where the argument lives. Then the story darkens. Because the final years of Akhenaten's reign grow murky, and the murk itself feels like part of the collapse. The records become harder to read. Names shift. Possible co-rulers appear. Nefertiti, so vivid in earlier scenes, becomes more uncertain in the surviving trail. There may have been a Smenkhare. There may have been a Neferneferuaten. Scholars still debate exactly who held power, when, and under what titles. That uncertainty matters. Stable systems leave clear succession. Fragile systems leave puzzles. And the world Akhenaten built was becoming a puzzle even before his body was gone. We do not have a dramatic final speech. We do not have a clean cinematic death scene preserved in full. What we have is more haunting than that. A reign of about 17 years ending in fog. Then movement. Fast movement. The revolution did not long outlive the revolutionary. A successor briefly held the center, but the old order was already pressing back. Then came the boy king we know as Tutankhamun. He had likely been born Tutankhaten, a name honoring the Aten. Soon that changed. He became Tutankhamun, honoring Amen instead. That one alteration tells you almost everything. Egypt was turning around. The restoration of the old gods was not just policy. It was a public exhale. Temples reopened. Traditional cults regained life. The court drifted away from Akhetaten. The city that had been announced as the chosen horizon of a god now looked temporary, exposed, and strangely brittle. And this is the cruelest irony in the entire story. Akhenaten had tried to make Aten central by tying the god to the person of the king. But once the king died, Aten's official supremacy died with him. He had built a religion too dependent on one human throat, too concentrated, too exclusive, too hostile to the old roots he expected people to sever without resistance. The old gods returned not because Akhenaten had failed to build enough monuments. He built plenty. They returned because memory in Egypt was older than his certainty. Because village shrines, funerary hopes, priestly networks, family customs, and sacred geography could not be abolished by royal passion alone. Then came the vengeance of state memory. Tutankhamun helped reverse the religious revolution. I followed. But it was Horemheb especially who would help close the trap around Akhenaten's name. Monuments from the Amarna period were dismantled. Talat blocks were reused inside later constructions like broken bones hidden in new flesh. Royal lists were adjusted. The reigns connected to the Amarna experiment were pushed into silence or omission. This was not simple neglect. It was a cleanup operation. A civilization deciding that one of its own kings had become intolerable to remember honestly. And so the man who had attacked the names of other gods watched his own name disappear from stone. The ruler who had tried to erase a sacred order was erased in return. That is the moment where his story lands hardest. Not Aten mine of the new city. Not in the height of the sun cult. Here, in the counterstrike of memory. Because Egypt did not merely reject Akhenaten. It tried to cure itself of him. Imagine the scene. Workmen prying decorated blocks from abandoned temples. Scribes composing official pasts that skipped the Heretic King entirely. The desert wind blowing through a capital that had once claimed eternal favor. No great last stand. No one defending the revolution to the end. Just withdrawal, reuse, silence, and the patient machinery of forgetting. Akhetaten emptied. Homes were abandoned. State business flowed elsewhere. The city that had been created with such speed became a scar in the landscape. And for centuries, the scar mostly slept. This is why Akhenaten feels so modern to people. Not because he was modern. He was not. But because his story is painfully familiar. A ruler receives an overwhelming conviction. He decides institutions, traditions, and inherited loyalties are obstacles to purity. He centralizes truth in himself. For a moment, it looks like fearless genius. Then the same concentration of power makes the whole system break when he disappears. That does not mean Akhenaten was a cartoon villain. He is too strange, too complicated, and too intellectually daring for that. He may genuinely have believed he had grasped something deeper in divine reality. He may have seen the old religious system as crowded, compromised, and politically dangerous. He may have felt that the visible sun, giver of life to all lands, pointed toward a more universal power than local cults could hold. That vision is part of what still fascinates people. Even now, scholars argue over what exactly Atenism was. Was it true monotheism? Was it monolatry, a state-backed elevation of one god without fully erasing the category of others? Was it spiritual revolution, political consolidation, or both fused together? The debates continue because the man himself refuses to stay simple. But you do not need every scholarly dispute to understand the human core. Akhenaten believed he could force revelation to become civilization. That was the gamble. And Egypt proved him wrong. Still, for all the fury aimed at him, he was not erased completely. History has a habit of coughing up what states try to bury. In the modern age, excavations at Amarna and the study of reused blocks pulled his ghost back into view. Suddenly, the lost king returned. Not in triumph, but in fragments. A face from a relief. A boundary inscription. A letter in cuneiform from a foreign ruler. An abandoned city laid open by archaeology and desert light. And what a return it was. A pharaoh once cut out of history became one of the most discussed rulers in ancient Egypt. Not because he conquered the largest empire. Not because he left the grandest tomb. Because he pushed farther than most kings dared. He tried to replace an ancient sacred universe with one centered on a single blazing source and his own privileged access to it. He failed. But failed so spectacularly that the failure became immortal. Even his art changed the conversation. The Amarna style remains one of the most distinctive visual revolts in Egyptian history. Its intimacy, distortion, movement, and emotional charge still make older royal art feel almost frozen beside it. Its family scenes make Akhenaten's court feel near enough to touch. And that closeness deepens the tragedy. Because beneath the sunlight and tenderness was a system becoming less stable, not more. The same images that humanize him also expose how narrow the revolution had become. A whole kingdom asked to orbit one radiant household. That was never going to last. And then there is the final irony. Today, many people know the name Tutankhamun because his tomb survived almost untouched. But Tutankhamun's historical role makes far more sense once you see the world Akhenaten handed him. The boy king's restoration mattered because the father figure before him had broken so much. Akhenaten's shadow helped define everyone who came after. So was he a visionary? Yes, in one sense. Few rulers in Egyptian history were bolder in imagination. Was he a fanatic? Also yes, in the sense that he pressed one truth with so little room for anyone else's. Was he the first monotheist? That depends on how strictly you define the word, and historians still argue it. But here's what seems beyond argument. He discovered the limit of pharaonic power. A pharaoh could command labor, wealth, soldiers, and monuments. A pharaoh could not simply order an entire civilization to stop remembering itself. That is why Akhenaten still matters. Not as a weird detour. Not as a museum curiosity. But as one of history's clearest examples of how private certainty, when fused to absolute power, can burn bright enough to blind a kingdom. And maybe that is the real reason Egypt tried to erase him. Not because he was weak, because he showed just how dangerous a convinced ruler could be. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like so I know you want more rulers whose glory came with a hidden cost. And if you want deep cinematic histories of kings, emperors, conquerors, and the people who nearly reshaped the world, subscribe and stay with us. I also want your verdict. Was Akhenaten a genuine religious visionary, or a proud king who confused personal revelation with eternal truth? And tell me who you want next. Another pharaoh, a forgotten emperor, a conqueror at the edge of collapse, drop the name below. Because the next story might begin in a palace even richer than Amarna, or on a battlefield far louder than any temple court. Either way, it will be another ruler who looked invincible right before history turned on him. And once you see how fast a crown can become a curse, it gets very hard to look away from the next one.